Though surely not anything good, Brad interjects, and one of them was a woman he knew from the department. So that really lines up with what this Redditor is saying. We have got to talk about Bryan Kohberger's professor, how John Schneider feared that Bryan Kohberger being fired from his teacher's assistant position at WSU out there in Washington in 2022, how that could have potentially opened up Washington State University to a civil lawsuit. I want to talk about this alleged hit list Bryan Kohberger reportedly had written somewhere. I've been searching for it for days and can't find it. He reportedly had a hit list of 4 names. 4 names. As I understand it, I believe they were all women. I'm trying to separate rumors from fact. I just got off the phone with Moscow PD. They are great. Let me tell you, I love them. As many rejections as I'm getting trying to get Bryan Kohberger's arrest videos, I do believe they exist. Trying to get them from Pennsylvania, trying to get his interview videos. Moscow PD is not the custodian of those, so they've directed me to either ISP or Pennsylvania State Police. ISP, that's rejection too. Pennsylvania State Police, I believe they do have them. For some reason, they're just saying they are not open to the public. Something like that. You can see my wording on Twitter. So I've been like, if any lawyers out there specializing in public records fighting a commonwealth to get interview videos, please, let me know. But let's go back to this. I've been looking for this alleged hit list. Now, Bryan Kohberger's professor, this John Schneider, according to a recent interview he gave via the New York Post and this one writer's Substack, he said Bryan Kohberger had a list of women's names of unknown purpose. Now, there's more scuttlebutt on Reddit we'll go through a little bit later, telling us who exactly may have appeared at the top of this list and how when police allegedly informed her, she was shocked. She had no idea she was on some hit list. But in the meantime, you guys know I'm always looking for evidence. I like to see proof. I don't just like rumors and, So I want to find it in the seized inventory list, evidence list, anywhere, even if the names, of course, are still redacted due to privacy, which I understand. I haven't found a list of names anywhere, but I am still going through the ISP documents. So we're going to compare what John Schneider has told the New York Post via this one writer, and we'll compare what he told police during 3 different interviews about his experiences with Bryan Kohberger. Woo! How John Schneider had a, quote, fleeting thought that Bryan could indeed be the killer. This is before Bryan was arrested, the way I'm understanding it. We'll go over it all together. And part of me wondered, the way Schneider thought, he's like, we got to have evidence. We've got to have so much evidence that it's okay to fire Bryan because we made a commitment to him as a university, WSU. It was a big commitment. Move across the country, Bryan, and this is me not feeling sorry for Kohberger at all, but, move across the country. We made a commitment to pay for certain things. Firing a teacher's assistant in this circumstance, of course, would change his whole life. And so I was thinking, wow, what if they had waited? What if they didn't technically fire him? I mean, technically they didn't fire him until December 19th when Bryan was already back in Pennsylvania. But Bryan knew well before then he was losing his job. And part of me thought, wow, I applaud WSU for getting rid of Bryan. They had to, once you see all these altercations he got into with Schneider alone, and Schneider is like in his 60s. But I know they had to do it. They did the right thing. But of course, part of me couldn't help but wonder, wow, if they hadn't kind of gotten rid of him, or if he didn't know he was fired early on, would Bryan still have gone through and committed these crimes? Maybe he would. And we'll even talk about what happened on November 10th. One more thing that probably sent Bryan spiraling down. So anyway, let's talk about all of this. So John Schneider had these lawsuit fears. He's with the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Washington State University. He even had a fleeting thought Bryan could be the killer because of all his experiences with Bryan. Check out this list. I mean, Bryan just got there in July. Schneider learned about Bryan later. He went to a mixer with him. We'll get into those details. But by September 23rd, 2022, Bryan had, quote, a verbal altercation with Professor John Schneider, whom he was assisting. This was Schneider's teacher's assistant Snyder never had a guy, any teacher's assistant, I guess guy or girl, as horrible as Bryan. Then November 2nd, 11 days before Bryan slaughtered, Kaylee Gonzalez, 21, Maddie Mogan, 21 also, Xana Kernodle, she was 20, Ethan Chapin was also 20. Before he did that, on November 2nd, department officials at WSU met with Bryan to say, okay, here's an improvement plan. So they did their due diligence. They tried with him over and over again. He just didn't heed the warnings. And then we'll talk about this revised test question that Kohberger gave to John Snyder on November 10th. 2022, all the implications. That was only 3 days before Bryan committed those crimes. And then on December 9th, Bryan Kohberger had another altercation with Snyder, according to the Times. So all my links will be below. I'm listing all my sources below so you can see what I'm referring to. I'll probably intersperse this with some audio interview of the latest companion New York Post interview with that writer. What's his name? I got to find his name.
So my name is Brad Pierce, and Bryan Kohberger's professor is my drinking buddy. So I am a freelance journalist and writer. I live in my hometown of Palouse, Washington, which is a town of 1,000 people that is 15 minutes to the north of the University of Idaho. And at the time that the murders took place, very shocking for this area. You know, it would be shocking anywhere, but there are very few homicides here. This guy, John Snyder, who I know pretty well from the bar. My wife is a bartender and she is his favorite bartender, so they're pretty close. You know, he would come in after work for a beer and he was complaining all semester about this horrible grad student that he was TAing for him, and you know how difficult he was to be around, how he was doing a bad job, how he treated the students badly.
His name is Brad Pierce, so I can stop calling him just the writer. Apparently, Brad Pierce sat down for 2 hours and talked with Professor John Snyder in this bar. He's in Palouse, Washington. Brad Pierce's wife is John Snyder's favorite bartender. So they had a lot of time together, and people were hoping Brad had interviewed, John Snyder on camera. Maybe he didn't feel comfortable. So the article that was produced and this video interview, which is just with Brad, not with John Snyder, who, we want to hear from him face to face. It's pretty brief, but it gives us the broad strokes.
Everything like that. And, it's pretty normal to complain about your job. That's why people go to the bar after work. But finally, on December 30th, Bryan Kohberger was arrested. And it took me a few hours, but when I realized it was a Washington State University criminology graduate student, it occurred to me like, oh, this has to be John's graduate, like John's TA he was complaining about all semester. Then shortly after the new year, he came in looking so bad, my wife commented on it and just showed her the newspaper with Bryan Kohberger on the front of it. And that's when it was confirmed.
So it talks about John Snyder first came to WSU as an adjunct professor in the middle of his 30-year law practice. So I guess Snyder was a public defender, according to, Brad, according to Brad. And he defended nearly every type of criminal case. And they're going to talk about how usually in this section of Washington, they were used to just, kids getting in trouble. Maybe stuff with drinking, he defended stuff like that. Nothing like Bryan brought to town. So this article, it's called My Small Town Beer Buddy Vented About His Creepy Teaching Assistant All Semester, and it turned out to be Bryan Kohberger. This was published August 24th, 2025. A lot of people were talking about this. So we'll talk about this first, and then we'll talk about Snyder's interviews, and then we'll talk about the person on Reddit claiming they know more about this alleged Kohberger hit list, which was intimated, it's talked about in this article. During the investigation of Bryan Kohberger, police discovered a list of women's names among his belongings. The purpose of this list was unknown to authorities, though one of the names belonged to a woman from his academic department at Washington State University. Now, I've kind of gone through and I've seen what some of these women look like, and I try and figure out which ones he had the most problem with, trying to match it up with all the redacted names in the documents. But details about this list came from a professor, John Snyder, who worked with Kohberger in the criminology department, spoke to law enforcement after Bryan's arrest. John's department was searched by police on December 30th, 2022. So get this, that was like the same day Kohberger was arrested over here in Pennsylvania. Still trying to get that video and interview. Don't get me started with that. They're arresting Bryan Kohberger, and I do believe body cam exists, but to what extent, I don't know. Interview video definitely exists, according to the paperwork. Okay, Kohberger's being arrested. It's December 30th. Way across the country, WSU, that department is being searched, locked down in the basement or whatever, because they want to find out, okay. And they're talking to John Schneider that same day. Brad calls Schneider a kindly older man who lives in a small town. He's what you consider a normal person. A married homeowner, teaches at the local university, sounds like a good life. He'd been a public defender for almost 30 years, and then he took the opportunity to teach students about the legal system instead of defending those students, standing up there in court with them. So it says he was feeling like he was, near burnout in a demanding profession. I get that. He's in his 60s now. He's been grinding for 30 years as a lawyer. At a certain point, I know you want to kind of slow down and try and enjoy life. So Brad wrote, I've come to know John pretty well over the years, not just because we live in the same town. My wife, Alexis, is his favorite bartender. People are giving Brad a hard time, like, oh, you think Alexis is his favorite bartender? Just how much it's mentioned, I guess. But John likes going out for dinner with his wife or having a beer after work as much as the next guy, decompressing. But there was a marked theme to John's happy hour conversation in the fall of 2022. His teaching assistant in WSU's Criminal Justice and Criminology Department was an a-hole who was driving him crazy. I don't blame John for venting. Normal after-work grumbling, one might think, even if in a high quantity. So John had a lot to grumble about. Bryan Kohberger gave a lot of people a lot to complain about. 13 formal complaints. They couldn't ignore that. Lawsuit, threats or not, they could not ignore that. Brad writes, then bucolic life in our peaceful region was interrupted in November 2022 when 4 University of Idaho students were brutally murdered just 20 minutes away. After the new year, John came into the bar carrying a newspaper and looking bad enough that my wife said, what's wrong? You look like Ish. John held up the paper and confirmed what we suspected after the arrest. His teaching assistant was Bryan Kohberger.
Overall, there was a gag order on this case forever, which I actually found out that he wasn't under until kind of the end, because he was only going to get called as a sentencing witness or whatever. But anyway, once that ended, I knew he hadn't got to the media, so I got him to speak to me because we're friends. So we sat down for pictures at the bar, and we spoke for about 2 hours about his background and the experience of working with Bryan Kohberger. And I mean, in short, John's background is that he was a public defender for almost 30 years. That makes him pretty well known here. It's not a very high population area. It's one of those well-respected public-facing jobs where you kind of get to know everyone. And he did that for quite some time, and then he got the opportunity to teach at WSU, and he decided to take it because he could feel that, an amount of burnout was coming for having worked as a public defender with a huge caseload for so long. And, around here, about half the population are students, so there's not a lot of serious crime, but there's a lot of, getting DUIs or minors drinking or marijuana charges before marijuana was legal here, etc. So mostly, young kids screwing up. He really wanted to make sure they got good representation and, it wouldn't ruin their lives too much. But he moved on to teaching, and that went well. He's well liked by his students and colleagues. But then it was the case that, in June of 2022, someone came to introduce himself and said, I'm your new TA. My name is Bryan Kohberger. At the time, he thought he was kind of odd, didn't have a lot of, charisma or that sort of thing. But it's fairly normal in academia. It didn't really stand out.
So it says, John has avoided the media since Kohberger's arrest, but due to our friendship, he agreed to meet me at the Palouse Caboose, that's cute, Palouse Caboose Bar and Grill, where my wife is a bartender, mentions it again, for some pitchers of beer in his first, probably only, in-depth interview about supervising Bryan Kohberger. Well, people are hoping that Brad gives us more info. We don't know if John will talk to anyone else or what. But John graduated from University of Idaho Law School back in 1988. He began working as a public defender. Wow, I graduated from FAMU in 1990. Anyway, John's specialization through his legal career, I guess being a public defender was his specialization throughout his legal career. John said, quote, criminals are more honest and easier to work with than people going through a divorce. I hear ya. I've heard a lot of lawyers say they avoid family law like the plague because they don't want to be involved in the War of the Roses, people fighting over a dish or an ice cube tray. But John was also attracted to the field by his sense of justice and desire to see people who may have disadvantages within society treated fairly by the legal system. I love that. Brad called Snyder something of a troublemaker himself. His skill at pool paid his bar tabs all through law school. So what is this, like Moneyball? He could imagine being caught making some of the same mistakes as his clients. Okay, he occasionally dealt with homicides or other serious crimes, but in a college town, it's mostly young people screwing up. John doesn't feel this career has given him any greater ability to sense evil than the average person. So that's interesting. Some people are like, why couldn't his professors sense what Bryan was going to do? As a professor, John had a high volume of students and couldn't get to know many of them well. Teaching assistants are different, and in normal circumstances, one works with them extensively. Okay, Brad says it used to be that professors chose their preferred potential teacher's assistants from a list, but for reasons he never discovered, the school abandoned the system and randomized the process, which is how he was assigned Kohberger. Talk about the misfortune of the draw. That's not the luck of the draw. If you're like, here's Kohberger, you get to spend so much time with him. When the graduate student who is Kohberger came to introduce himself to Snyder early in summer 2022, it says Snyder didn't think much of him. Quote, he was a little odd, but a lot of people in academia are odd. So, he didn't notice anything right away.
And then, the semester started. And he quickly, as he described it, was, disabused of the notion that he was going to get any real work out of him. There was, a bit of a scheduling conflict, so he didn't see him all that much. But even so, he didn't go to work very much. He didn't get the papers graded. And when he did try to do any work, it was, kind of trying to prove how smart he was, even though, according to John, he's not really very bright whatsoever. And, he wasn't getting along with the students. He was creeping out the girls. One of them emailed a friend saying that she thought that her TA looked like a serial killer.
Despite the TA assignment system being designed to prevent this exact problem, Kohberger had a scheduling conflict and thus limited attendance in class, though he also often didn't show up when available. So wait, Kohberger's scheduling conflict, did he have classes that coincided with his TA duties? I wonder what that was. But even when Bryan could have shown up, especially to some female professor's classes, apparently he didn't, or he showed up late or whatever. The infrequency of his class appearances didn't stop one female student from emailing a friend near the semester's start. Quote, my class's TA looks like a murderer. Did she not hit the nail on the head? Whoever this Dateline watching, law and crime consuming female student likely is, she hit the nail on the head. She took one look at Kohberger and was like, he looks like a murderer. Ugh. Psycho. Dexter. Which clean-cut manner of evil is Bryan Christopher Kohberger? He's a 6-foot-tall, 185-pound white male with blue eyes and brown hair.
Kohberger was very quiet and awkward. It was awkward having him in the pod. He was highly intelligent. His eyes were creepy. This is from the other inmate. Told him Kohberger said his favorite movie was American Psycho with Christian Bale. So Snyder's favorite bartender in a small town is author Brad Pierce's wife, Alexis, as we know. Snyder says he tries to look at his teacher's assistants' individual attributes and put them to work where they will be most useful while training them on their weaker points. That's pretty cool. If I was his TA, maybe he'd be like, Paula, you're good at teaching, and I don't know, your presentation skills could use some work, so let's do this, or whatever, In this instance, however, quote, Bryan quickly disabused me. I found that an interesting word to use. Snyder said, Bryan quickly disabused me of the idea that I would get a sufficient amount of work out of him, and I quickly figured out that he was a bit of a douche. And within a few weeks, I realized this was going to be an exceptionally long semester.
But despite this, John said that he still saw him quite a lot because Kohberger would regularly go to his office and talk to him about various inane, immature, uninteresting things at the end of the day when John obviously wanted to go home. And he said that he came to realize this was a control technique where Bryan felt like he was in control as long as he was able to waste his time. And I thought that was very interesting because I've not really known anyone that does that. Like I've never perceived that's happening to me before. And, over time, he started following him around. John called it his terrier routine. Bryan would be yapping at his heels while he was doing things.
Somehow Bryan gave John the impression you're not going to get a sufficient amount of work out of me. Remember we talked about the other guy who, thank God, my YouTube video is still up. Despite the privacy complaint, but the guy his name is found in the court documents. But he worked with Bryan Kohberger, and he said Bryan lied about little things. Bryan manipulated him to do his work. So if Bryan is so smart, if he claimed to be just this whiz, this smart guy, why was he trying to get everyone else to do his work? I mean, maybe he thought that was smart. Just like Bryan, he's going to tell John Schneider about how he got away with some kind of parking. Some people have that notion, like if they can get over on someone, if they can manipulate someone, they feel like that gives them one up. It's not the case. So despite Bryan missing class, Schneider still saw him plenty. Schneider said he rapidly developed the habit of coming in at the end of the day when I clearly wanted to go home. He would start talking about inane, stupid, and immature things. I quickly realized this was a technique where he felt like he was in control as long as he was wasting my time. I find that really interesting. Like some people do that, and part of me wonders, okay, was Bryan a very lonely person? And he had just moved to Washington. Again, no excuses for him. I'm not coddling him. I'm no Bryan Kohberger fan by a long shot. I'm just trying to understand. I believe Bryan would do this to other people. So if he approached Schneider at the end of the day when he knows someone wants to go home and he's cornering all these people, talking about stupid things that don't matter, was Bryan really lonely? I'm wondering, not only was it a control thing, but was Bryan really doing this also because he's like, I'm about to go home to an empty apartment. All these people have friends and family members. If I catch Schneider just to talk about things that don't matter, will that fill up part of my lonely evening? That's what I wonder too. You know how they talk about the weird communication between Bryan and his parents? He would call them mother and father. From what we've seen through some of the court records and reports, it's like Bryan was like calling mother, and it's like, mother, where are you? Father, where is mother? She did not answer my call. I remember certain points, we'll probably get to this maybe in a different video, where Bryan was just like, I guess, used to talking to his parents often, and if they weren't available, it was kind of like, why? It sounds like Bryan was ready to talk to people when he was ready, and they better have time for him. And you know how he talked with his mom in jail, all those video visits we heard about, like daily, calls or whatever that lasted for hours. And then there was one point we saw through the records where Bryan's mom said something like, that's it, or I will call you, or, she was kind of clapping back at him in a certain way that let you know their relationship dynamic sounded like it was one where Bryan wanted you available. Those type of friends where they want you, I want you when I want you. You better call when I pick up. And you're like, no, we'll get together when the time is right for both of us. It says Bryan once told John how he was going to get out of a parking ticket, even managing to get him to examine the scene. So what parking ticket was this? I was like, oh my goodness, was this another stop? But it was just a parking ticket. It turned out Bryan had parked next to a yellow curb in a lot where he didn't even have a permit anyway. So how did he plan to get out of that? I wonder if he did. It says admonitions, in John's experience as a defense attorney, people who believe they know the law better than the courts are always wrong. That fell on deaf ears. So John, an older man, 30 years as a public defender, I think he would know a little bit about the law. I would defer to him. I would listen to him if I was just, a TA going for my PhD. I mean, granted, yeah, Bryan had his bachelor's and his master's. I'm sure he knew some things, but that doesn't mean he couldn't have learned some stuff about this man who's lived in Washington all these years, very familiar with local laws, very familiar with the university. But Bryan didn't want to listen to him. John says over time, Kohberger would follow me down the hall yapping, and I started calling it his terrier routine. That's so true. I always knew like a guy tends to like you. The way you know a guy likes you is sometimes if they follow you around like a puppy dog. So when he says it's a terrier routine, well, this wasn't like a kind sort of affection. This was like Bryan, yep, 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 like a little terrier following him down the hall. Like he wouldn't even catch a clue. That used to be my clue when I worked in corporate America. And you got to get stuff done, but people like to come by your desk and chat, and that's fine. Some people would chat so long I would have to just get up and walk away. Most people would get the clue. I go to the break room, I'm going to the bathroom, wherever, just to get away because I gotta focus, That's why I like working at home. I can focus more. Bryan didn't get those clues, obviously. It says when John's wife was waiting for him in the car once, she saw Bryan Kohberger following him and recoiled nearly to the other side, a reaction he'd never seen from her in many years of marriage. So people are like, what was it about him? People want to hear from the wife. People want to hear details like maybe she just could sense that evil. The same way that girl was like, my class TA looks like a murderer. It was just something about him. Maybe those dark eyes, maybe his aura, his presence, spirit of evil, maybe just surrounded him.
In one instance, John was going to pick up something from his wife for a Christmas party, and Kohberger followed him down the hill, talking behind him. And he said that his wife was so disturbed just by seeing him and his presence that she basically flinched all the way to the other side of the car. Just because she had both been hearing him complain about the guy, but that's also just kind of the reaction that people had to being around him. It's very much a contrast to that. When you hear like a serial killer's neighbor say like, oh, he was the nicest guy, you never would have suspected anything. Kohberger was not at all covering up that he was at least a very unpleasant person, though John always assumed he was harmless just because he seemed kind of physically weak and wimpy and not very self-confident. And then, of course, I guess you don't have to be that strong to try to murder sleeping people.
Schneider had grown to hate Bryan over the course of the semester, but never thought he was dangerous. Now, that kind of conflicts, well, maybe it doesn't conflict with Snyder's fleeting thought we'll learn about from the police interviews that Bryan could actually be a murderer. Maybe that was only in hindsight, after the murders, but prior to Bryan's arrest. But in this article, it says, look, John hated Bryan. He grew to hate him, but he never thought he was dangerous. He actually considered Bryan a wimp. And that's one factor, his, physical weakness combined with his annoyance. We're going to learn Snyder thinks, Bryan's not going to make it in prison because of those horrible attributes. So it says Snyder learned about Kohberger's arrest along with everybody else. He was in his office December 30th. It was nearly an empty building. Everyone had, I'm sure, gone home over the holidays. The custodian told Snyder the police had the basement sealed off. They ended up walking to a picture board of department members, and the custodian started pointing at the photos, speculating whose office the police might be searching. When the custodian got to Kohberger, it hit him. His teaching assistant was the murderer. So was that the fleeting thought he's going to tell police about? I don't know. Let's see. But then Snyder's phone rang. His brother-in-law told him Bryan had been arrested. That call was interrupted by John's son calling, which was then interrupted by the Moscow, Idaho police calling to set up an immediate interview. He drove to Moscow instead of waiting around for them to show up. So that's why they got that interview so quickly. That was smart of him. He's like, look, I'm coming to you. I'll tell you everything I know. From the police, he learned Kohberger had a list of women's names of unknown purpose, though surely not anything good, Brad interjects, and one of them was a woman he knew from the department. So that really lines up with what this Redditor is saying. This Redditor I'll talk about was saying Bryan had a list of 4 names. The article says, but overall he wasn't able to greatly help them besides describing Bryan's character.
Anyway, after this happened, when John discovered it, he was kind of alone in the department building over Christmas break, and it started being searched, and they started looking at a board to try to figure out, whose office the police were there searching. And as soon as he saw Kohberger's picture, he kind of realized what was going on. And then his phone started blowing up with just everyone calling him saying that Kohberger had been arrested. So he went to speak to the police in Moscow immediately, instead of waiting around for them.
Having worked with a mass murderer was a system shock for John, even if he always disliked the guy. The university's standard trauma assistance programs proved unhelpful. That's horrible. John is reaching out for help from this trauma assistance program. But the support hotline he called listed every imaginable identity group besides his own, old white men, and then said it could set up an appointment in 2 weeks. So I hope John got the help and counseling from the wonderful counselor he needed, because everyone a lot of people had to be traumatized by Kohberger.
Something that really struck me about this is just the way your feeling of safety is violated when you've known someone like this. The person's met your wife. He's been around all sorts of other people that you care about. And he did say, though, that the amount of support that he got from students and from, other people in the department was like one of the most touching things that he has ever experienced. And though, it's made him feel kind of more socially withdrawn having gone through this, that at the same time, it caused him to feel the most supported that he's ever really felt. It's very difficult. He talked about how kind of what Kohberger did was a direct attack on what he does because, he wasn't a public defender and he taught criminal justice because he wanted to, make our country more fair for people, make sure people were represented properly in the legal system, that they didn't get railroaded, that, the people that work in this profession are well trained and that they're compassionate and that they know to, understand the problems the people they're working with might have. And meanwhile, here was this person who, as far as we can tell, was studying criminology to be a better serial killer. He felt like it was an attack on his entire profession and career. This is probably John's last year teaching, not just because of Kohberger, but because he's an older man. He's been working really hard for a long time, trying to make our society more fair and just in his own way. And, it's kind of time for someone else to take up the torch. I'm really grateful that John was willing to do the interview. I think it provides a lot of insight into the experience of being, kind of indirectly impacted by a crime. So I hope this will help people understand his role in this and hopefully make people more sympathetic to the work that is done in, criminal justice programs and by public defenders.
But John says the stream of graduate students and undergrads coming into his office to offer support was, quote, one of the coolest things I've ever experienced. That's so sweet. He ended up getting help from all these graduate students and even undergrads who they probably needed to talk just as much as he did, like this symbiotic relationship that can really help them all heal and compare experiences with the weirdo. So the department chair also transferred his own excellent teaching assistant to John for the next semester to ease his workload. Good, he got someone better who would ease his workload, so there would be no more surprises. John says the reality of the crime isn't what bothers him. It is instead someone studying criminology to become a better criminal instead of to pursue justice. That's a really weird thing to do. Most of the people who are like normal people taking criminology classes, they are doing it to become law enforcement officials or whatever, to help fight for justice for victims, not to create victims. John said it was the assault on why I do what I do, promote justice and fairness, to find honor where there isn't any, to teach people to be decent human beings and to realize that life goes on, and to let people who had not experienced respect from the system know that the power to move past their troubles is inside them. Most of the people he worked with throughout his career were in bad circumstances and needed help out of the abyss, while Kohberger chose to dive into it. Yeah, Bryan dove into the abyss. When did he decide to do that? As we kind of talk over this timeline of how things went, whew. Though this may be over for the public, for those affected, it will never go away. And a feeling of safety is slow to return when you learn you have been in close contact with a murderer. So that was author Brad Pierce. He said, this is likely Snyder's last year teaching, not just because of Bryan Kohberger, but he has been working since 1988, first this long 30-year, 3-decade career as a public defender, and then as an adjunct professor. Brad said, let's hope some of the students he's taught over the last 10 years can pick up the torch and none of them turns out to be the next Bryan Kohberger. Oh, I hate to say it, but in the back of my mind somewhere, I'm like, I hope he does not create this copycat criminal. You know how Kohberger has, to me, an inordinate amount of fans, and maybe it just seems that way because of social media and the way things seem so prolific these days. But I was thinking, oh my goodness, what if he does inspire a copycat criminal? Brad says, as for his former teacher's assistant, as for Bryan, it is John's belief that being both extremely irritating and physically weak, he won't survive to the end of his natural life in prison. He might be right there. So Brad Pierce also writes for the Wayward Rabbler on Substack. So let me read to you, before we talk about what this person on Reddit is claiming, who was exactly on Bryan's so-called hit list, kill list, or whatever. Let me go to page 466 of these ISP documents and talk about Schneider's 3 interviews. If you're on page 466 of this 556-page document, I'm only laughing because ISP, they're coming out clapping back like, whoever called it a 600-page document, they are inaccurate. I mean, that made me laugh. But anyway, you've got to find the humor where you can here. Let's talk about these 3 interviews very briefly that Schneider gave police. So it says the Idaho State Police Detective Sergeant Van Leuven interviewed WSU, basically professor, a lot of it's redacted, John Schneider. He was born in 1960, interviewed him on 3 occasions. The first occasion was December 30th, 2022 at MPD. So that's when John drove right over. Second time was January 3rd, 2023. That was a telephone call. Third time was January 11th, 2023. So the purpose was to discuss his interactions, of course, with Bryan. Back then he was 61, so maybe he's like, Schneider should turn 65 this year. So that sounds like a great age to retire. So December 30th, when he interviewed Schneider at MPD, and I'm going to try and do my best to just fill in what I think the redactions are likely saying. Granted, I could be wrong because I can't see behind the black marks. So it says, I was joined in this interview with ISP Sergeant Jess Stennett. So prior to becoming this professor at WSU, he worked as a lawyer, public defender in Whitman County in Washington. He began working for WSU in the late 90s, perhaps, or the police department, working in some department, continuing his work as a lawyer, perhaps. In 2015, he began WSU full-time, splitting his time between governmental studies and services and perhaps criminology department. In 2018 or 2019, he came to WSU full-time in the criminology department. That's my assumption. So Schneider knew Kohberger was going to be one of his teacher's assistants in June or July of 2022. He didn't meet Bryan in person until August. Bryan was an incoming PhD student in the department. He knew Bryan was from a small private school back east. Schneider said Bryan seemed sharp and personable enough when he first met him. Schneider had not read Kohberger's master's dissertation. Schneider had no part in Bryan's acceptance to the PhD program. He didn't know he was going to be assigned to Kohberger. He didn't know Kohberger would be his teaching assistant. I asked Schneider about a couple of incidents of unprofessional behavior associated with Bryan. I had read in a letter from the faculty advising Kohberger that he had lost his TA position. I want to know the date of that letter. Schneider said the first incident that occurred with Mr. Kohberger was a time when someone was in his office. This must be Schneider, I guess, was in his office and was wanting to leave to go home. This was on Friday. Mr. Kohberger showed up at the end of the day, wanted to talk. So that lines up with what he was saying with Brad. Schneider said it was pretty clear he wanted to leave and Bryan wanted to talk. Schneider said this was not his first time. This happened with Bryan, where he would show up late in the day and want to talk. Schneider said this behavior had bothered him for a while. He said he would typically have his 40 hours in by the end of Thursday, and he didn't want to work late on Fridays, and he resented it when Bryan would show up to talk on Fridays. I asked him what Bryan would want to talk about. Schneider said nothing in particular, and that there was nothing remarkable about any of the conversations. Schneider said some of the subjects that were discussed in the past involved how to brief a case or how to deal with plagiarism, or also just general activities, recreation activities on the Palouse. So to me, Bryan sounded like he needed a friend. And I'd like to think, if he were a kind guy, you didn't know he was like a murderer, I'd like to think I would have given him maybe some of my time, 20 minutes or more, just to chat. But to monopolize a person's time when you know they want to go home, that's kind of rude. Or, I don't know, maybe Snyder didn't want to deal with him that much, but I was like, what if he had invited Bryan over to the bar to have a beer? But then would Bryan have continued to be so obnoxious that, I don't know. But it says after 10 to 20 minutes, there was an exchange that perturbed Snyder where Bryan wouldn't get to the point and let Snyder go home. At one point, Bryan told Snyder that he was snarky. So Bryan's calling Snyder snarky. Snyder became tired and frustrated and told Bryan to leave his office, and he did not. So Snyder got up and walked out of his office. He said Bryan followed him out of his office and continued talking to him. Like that terrier, I guess. Snyder said he walked down the hall to the main office where he knew Bryan had some run-ins with others. So Bryan had already had run-ins with other people in the main office. After several late afternoon, evening encounters, Snyder wasn't sure if Kohberger was trying to curry favor or whether he was trying to control Snyder's time. That is interesting. At some point, Snyder concluded Bryan was power tripping by using Snyder's time and preventing him from leaving his office as a way of controlling him, I guess. John advised he has had over 8 teacher's assistants in the past, and he never had a problem with any of them. Snyder talked about Kohberger walking and talking with him as Snyder walked to his car. Snyder remembered Kohberger bragging about outsmarting the parking regulations on campus. Like that's something to brag about. Like just pay for, a parking pass, whatever. Snyder talked about difficulty in getting Kohberger to complete his tasks as a teaching assistant. Now, that's just, that would get on my nerves. He's supposed to be there, do your duty, Snyder said he had been advised by department higher-ups to be more direct in making his expectations clear to Kohberger. So it's Snyder, talk to this man like he's a 2-year-old, tell him what you expect. Snyder advised Bryan's behavior didn't really change from the time before the homicides or after the homicide. So whereas some people did say Bryan seemed a little bit messier after the murders, or people noticed injuries before and after the murders on Bryan, but they also said his grading eased up a little bit after the murders. But Snyder didn't see a change in behavior. He said he never received any direct complaints about Bryan interacting with any of the undergrad students in his capacity as a teaching assistant. Snyder further advised the female grad students didn't like Bryan because he was that off-putting. He sounds like it. Snyder said we should talk to a female front office staffer who was an undergrad student working on a work-study program who had made complaints about Bryan's behavior. So that's at least one woman's complaining. Snyder advised he had had secondhand information that he had made several of the female PhD students very uncomfortable because of interactions they had with Bryan. So that's several more women, several PhD, candidates. I asked Snyder about which grad students we may want to interview that may have had a problem with Bryan. Snyder advised me there were 2 students from blank, I don't know, WSU, whatever. He said they were fellow PhD students named blank, last name not said, later identified as blank, and of course all these women are redacted. Further advised we should speak with faculty members blank, and blank, who was the blank of grad students, maybe the dean. I asked Snyder if he ever socialized with Bryan. He advised he had attended a mixer somewhere where 20 to 25 people from the department attended. Snyder was accompanied by his wife, and he recalled nothing unusual at that mixer. I wonder if that's the one where Bryan drank a whole bottle of wine, or maybe that was later. Snyder talked about the process by which Bryan's behavior eventually led to his removal as a teaching assistant. Snyder advised he initially supported Bryan until after a second event that Snyder could not remember the details of. Maybe that was that second run-in Snyder had, confrontation. It sounds like it almost got physical, maybe. I don't know. Snyder advised Bryan's removal was a result of a cumulative effect of his behavior. So Bryan was, getting on a lot of people's nerves, and there were multiple instances. So Bryan had a lot of chances. After the homicides occurred, John said he did consider the possibility that Bryan had committed the murders. So after these, horrible deaths, Snyder characterized this as a fleeting thought, but he did have a thought. It could have been Bryan. Snyder considered Bryan's power-tripping, controlling tendencies in addition to being socially challenged. Snyder advised Kohberger had alienated or irritated several female PhD students, as well as at least one female professor with his behavior. I think I might know who it is. I wonder if it's that pretty redhead, like that French woman. Anyway, Snyder said Kohberger never discussed knives or edge weapons. We asked Snyder about this survey that Kohberger had conducted with persons who had committed crimes. You remember we saw that on Reddit, the Inside Looking account. Snyder said he was unaware of this and we should contact someone else, another staffer, about Bryan's PhD activities. But Snyder talked about a conversation. This is it. This is leading up to that November 10th, I think, incident. Snyder talked about a conversation he had with Bryan early on where they discussed the idea of sexual harassment. Maybe this is different. Snyder knew that Bryan had alienated himself from the female grad students by this time. This included 6 or 7 women. He got on the nerves of more than half a dozen women. Bryan came up with a line of thought where he said, what if Bryan had heard about maybe John behaving inappropriately with women? What would John do to defend himself against a false accusation? So John found this line of thought to be troubling and thought Bryan was trying to put himself in a position of power. So the way I understand this is, look, Bryan's in real life already getting on all these women's nerves. But Bryan's coming up to John and saying, okay, what if I had heard about you, John, behaving inappropriately with women? What would you do to defend yourself against a false accusation? Like Bryan was picking his brain, like, how do I defend myself? But these accusations are real. But they're talking about sexual harassment. So that would be very insulting. This, married professor, 30-year career as a lawyer, all of a sudden Bryan's like, well, what if people were accusing you of harassment? How would you defend yourself? Anyway, that's different than the November 10th. Snyder said he didn't remember any physical injuries visible on Bryan after the homicide, so he didn't see that. This conversation was recorded. It was later provided to MPD to be placed into evidence. MPD has it. I might request it. I'm starting a spreadsheet of all these costs. Then, January 3rd, 2023, Sergeant Stennett and I spoke with Snyder via telephone. So Snyder advised them he's been thinking more about Bryan. He considered the issue about whether Bryan was power tripping or just socially inept. He considered it didn't matter. So whether Bryan couldn't pick up on social clues or if he was doing this stuff on purpose to get on people's nerves, Snyder said it didn't matter. Snyder talked about having coffee with a female staffer named Blank, and she had concluded Kohberger was power tripping, or maybe he did. Snyder thought she was right on her opinion, so it must have been the woman who said, look, he's power tripping. He's not this socially inept, to realize what's going on. Because people who are neurodivergent or they don't understand certain social clues, that doesn't mean they're doing it on purpose to power trip. They just don't know. And sometimes once they're made aware, they change their behavior. But obviously Bryan didn't. He got worse. Snyder said Kohberger told him that Bryan lived near to where Blank would park while at work. So I don't know if this is some woman, wherever she parked, Kohberger saying, I live near there. But then Snyder found that odd because after Kohberger was arrested and the media reported where Kohberger lived, those step-toe apartments, Snyder advised that the building shown, by the media, this is where Kohberger lives, step-toe apartments, it was completely different than the one Kohberger had indicated to Snyder. So maybe Bryan was saying, I live down there near where she parks her car. That's why I walk that way or whatever. You know how he cornered allegedly women too, walking them to their cars. So much so that some of them got escorts to protect them. Okay. He didn't even live near there. All these little lies. So Snyder also wanted to make it known he was willing to assist the Latah County prosecutor in this case if he could be of service. I asked Snyder about Kohberger's research work. Snyder advised we follow up with the program director who oversaw Kohberger's research. So that was recorded and placed on a disc with the other audio recordings. Now, January 11th, 2023, Special Agent Mark Zahazwicki, and I spoke with Snyder at maybe WSU. He advised he had spoken with people in the maybe criminology department about this incident. Specifically, he had spoken with Blank. And that person reminded Snyder about a test question regarding the difficulty in prosecuting rape crimes. This is the November 10th issue. Snyder had asked Kohberger to look at the question he had written and to make a revision to the question. We don't know what the question was. When Snyder received the revised question back from Bryan, he found it to be useless because the language in the question would be triggering to many students. So this is Kohberger writing about some difficulty in prosecuting rape cases, but Snyder is saying the language was dismissive of the victims. I don't know what the question was. I don't know how Bryan phrased it, but however he phrased it obviously didn't show care and concern to these victims of this type of assault especially. Snyder gave me a printout of his original question and the revised question that Bryan had produced and given to Snyder on November 10th, 2022. That's like 3 days before the murders, and I'm thinking, was Bryan being snippy? He had to change his question. He didn't like doing work anyway. He changed it, and it was still not good. So November 10th, was that the day he stopped using his debit card or not? I've heard, switch stories on that, but was that another thing, like that last straw that broke the camel's back in Bryan's perspective, to get some retribution, get back at women who he didn't even know? I also scanned these printouts, placed them in the same disc with the audio recordings. They further discuss incidents Bryan have already been covered in previous interviews, issues he had with females in the program, discussions regarding the process of the TA position being terminated. He discussed his past experience with TAs compared to current TAs. Snyder discussed his opinion that Bryan, this surprised me, should have been kept on as a TA. I believe it's Snyder's opinion because Snyder believed that WSU had an obligation to continue to honor their commitment in offering him a TA position. Kohberger relied on that commitment, and if WSU was going to remove that from him, WSU needed to make sure they had thoroughly documented the reasons why. I think they had more than enough documentation with 13 complaints and all these run-ins or interactions. Snyder said he was concerned that removing Kohberger from the TA position without doing so, without, proper documentation, would open WSU up to a civil lawsuit from Bryan. I wish Bryan would have taken that course. If he would have been a calm, rational person, if he felt like he was done wrong, for example, I wish he would have just taken his butt back to Pennsylvania. Fine, sue the university, but don't get some horrific retribution on people, innocent people. On anyone, not in this manner. So Snyder talked about a situation where he was meeting with Blank and Bryan in his office in order to prepare final exam questions for his undergraduate students. Bryan announced he had to have a Zoom meeting with another student. So Snyder assumed, Bryan was advising, okay, I'm going to go leave for the meeting and could not help with the exam prep. Instead, Bryan proceeded with the Zoom meeting in Snyder's office, preventing Snyder and the other person from preparing the exam. So Snyder had to tell Kohberger to leave his office. That's so weird. Like, you go to Snyder's office and it's like, whatever, I got a Zoom meeting. Okay. He starts having the Zoom meeting like right there. Anyway, Snyder advised that someone had provided him with a slightly different version of the revised exam question referenced above. Snyder did recall this question, discussing it with someone. So they discussed Bryan's tendency to stare at people, though Snyder thought that Kohberger did this in a way to display power or dominance. Snyder mentioned a senior named someone that complained that Kohberger stared at her a lot in class, made her feel uncomfortable. Snyder advised he didn't observe any inappropriate behavior from Bryan aimed at any undergraduate students. He said he thought Bryan did a good job in correcting poorly written answers, and he had not observed any bias or inappropriate tone in grading. So he did say that. One student made a complaint about this, but Snyder didn't see it. Now let's quickly discuss what this Petunia Pineapple account is claiming on Reddit. I've linked to it. She or he is saying, I tried to tell another sub about this, but the police called it allegedly a hit list, but didn't really elaborate on what the indicators were. Did it have just 4 names? Did it have drawings or anything? The thing is, this woman had no idea about this until the police came to talk to her right before the trial was supposed to start. She's known for being a tough instructor, knowledgeable, but kind of mean and abrasive. I've read her online reviews from students, this person says. She definitely rubs a lot of people in our family the wrong way, kind of domineering to her husband, who is also sweet and docile. I don't know, I know women like this, but yeah, I'm sure Bryan wouldn't take too kindly to them. Knowing what we know about Bryan's view of women, I can guarantee Bryan hated her with a passion. The police told her she was at the top of the list. She had no idea she was on the list. He made other people uncomfortable. She lives near WSU on the other side of the state from me, so I rarely see her. And they're trying to find out if she had a specific blow-up or incident with Bryan, but he made her and other female students very uncomfortable. I've got to skedaddle, so let me read Colossians 1:19-20. For it pleased the Father, for all the fullness of deity, the sum total of his essence, all his perfection, powers, and attributes, to dwell permanently in him, the Son, and through the intervention of the Son, to reconcile all things to himself, making peace with believers through the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. I've got more evidence from this case coming. It's going to take a while. I talked to Moscow PD this morning. Great people. I'm going to go now, edit this sucker, hopefully get it up tonight, and just stay tuned. I'm researching this and many other cases. Find the links below. Take care. Thank you.